All right, so welcome back to another midweek with Double Creek. Right now we are in week 42 out of our 52 weeks with Jesus from that book by James Merritt. We're still in section 6. After today we have 2 more weeks in this section. This section is called Jesus the Helper. And so what we are seeing each week in this section, what we've really seen over and over throughout these 42 weeks now, is that Jesus is just different, isn't he? He talked different, he reacted different, he loved and served different. And today we're going to see another time where Jesus does something totally different than what everybody else was going to do or was even willing to do. Today's lesson comes from John chapter 7, verse 53. It's the last verse in John, and it goes through chapter 8, verse 11. And it's titled, A Gracious Judge. Now, this is another one of those famous encounters that Jesus has with someone that nobody else was willing to do anything with at this time. Now, even if they could help this person, they didn't want to. Today we look at the story known as the woman caught in adultery. To me, this story kind of hits hard in our world today, and that's because of a couple things. We have 2 sides here sometimes with judging in our world. We have the side that says, don't judge me. We have the other side that judges too much. And I think this lesson right here is going to hit both of those sides, both of those arguments for our world today. So let's see what happens in this story. They each went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in their midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. Now, this is one of the most famous encounters that we have of Jesus, when he has an encounter with somebody who was caught red-handed. Somebody who was caught with their hand in the cookie jar, as we might say today. Now, what does it mean when someone is caught with their hand in the cookie jar? Typically, we might say that when someone is caught doing something they should not be doing, especially if it comes to stealing or taking something. And so Merritt opens up this chapter by talking about being caught in the act. And he tells a story of a mother who was teaching her young son how to read a non-digital clock. You know, it's easy in our day and time because we just have digital clocks, numbers on them, right? We look at our watches, we look at our phones, we look at our computers, we look at our microwaves, our coffee makers, whatever we've got non-digital clocks all around us. But in school we learn how to read a non-digital clock with the little hands and the big hands. So she spent weeks and days and weeks trying to teach her son about this little hand and the big hand. Well, one day she heard her son walk into the kitchen where they have a non-digital clock with the little hand and the big hands on it. And she yells from the other room, What's the little hand on? And he yells back, A chocolate chip cookie. Apparently, his little mind was thinking where his little hand was at that moment and that he was caught in the act. Well, Merritt then mentions that if you're into legalese, how things are legally termed, things like that, you might come across a Latin term that means while the crime is blazing. That's where this little boy was, or felt he was, when his hand was in the cookie jar, literally. It indicates, while the crime is blazing, it indicates that someone has been caught in the act of doing some crime or committing some offense caught in the act, caught red-handed, caught with their hand in the cookie jar. No matter what phrase we use to describe it, there are a few things more embarrassing in life than being caught in the act doing something we shouldn't be doing. It could be caught doing something illegal, or it could be doing something to someone, or even gossiping. It could range from murder down to cheating on a test or just gossip. Getting caught red-handed while you're actually doing something is embarrassing for us, isn't it? And if we have any conscience ourselves, if we have any character about us, when we are caught in the act of doing something, it kind of leaves us feeling broken and guilty and full of shame. We've all been there at some point in time in our life. And that's exactly where this woman at the well, or this woman caught in adultery here in John chapter 8 is. She's caught in the act and she is broken. So merit talks to us about how Jesus is there for the broken. I use that term a lot, broken, because as human beings, that's what we are as a society. We are broken. As Christians, sometimes we are still broken because we still give in to temptation and sin. We're imperfect people. Well, think about it this way. If you go to a store and you're looking to buy a piece of pottery or some dinnerware set or something glass, and you see that it is broken, would you buy it anyway? No, we wouldn't want to buy it, would we? Because we wouldn't want that object if it was broken. We would only want it if it was perfect. And see, that's kind of what's going on here in this story in John chapter 8, but on a much bigger scale. And so what about us here in our world? What about us here at Double Creek Church of Christ, or at your church if you're listening to this? If someone is caught red-handed, if someone is not living the way that God wants us to live, how do we treat that person? Do we treat them like a broken piece of pottery or glass? Do we avoid being around them just because they're broken? Or do we treat them like Jesus would, like we see here in this story? Well, if one thing is for certain in the Scriptures, in life, it's this. We are all broken. In some way or form, we are broken. I remember when my neighbor, Kevin, we did all kinds of things together growing up. He was a couple years older than me, but we rode bikes together. We went down to the creek together and caught crawdads. We ran through the woods. We shot basketball. We played football. All this stuff we did together. There were some days where we were just inside our houses doing different things. And we were in our house one day running around. He was chasing me, and I run and I dove onto the couch. He takes the shortcut and jumps over the coffee table to land on me. And on that coffee table was this kind of glass figure set or whatever of Jesus with his hand up. And Kevin's leg caught that figurine, knocked it over, and broke it into pieces. From the other room, we heard a voice yell, "What was that?" And of course, we respond and say, "Nothing." But we were caught red-handed. The piece was broken. Nothing we could do about it. Well, my neighbor, Kevin, he spent a long time gluing that thing back together as best he could. Did a good job, good enough to where we could still set it out, but every time you looked at it, you could see that it was broken. You could see the cracks in it, or you could see a couple of spots where either we couldn't find a small piece or it wouldn't be glued back on or whatever. It was still broken. That's how the world views us. It's not how God views us as we are Christians, but it is certainly how the world views us. The world will look at us and they'll see the one thing that you do, even if it's just one time, and they will see you as broken and see you as useless and see you as a hypocrite. But Jesus came for broken. Remember the story from Mark chapter 2 when Jesus called Matthew the tax collector? Some versions might call him Levi, but Matthew the tax collector. He called him to be one of his followers. After he does this, Jesus then goes and eats with tax collectors and sinners. Some of the Pharisees and scribes, they see this going on and they ask his disciples, why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus hears this, and this is what happens in Mark 2:17. When Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Other versions might say that it's the healthy who need a doctor, not the sick. But you see, Jesus came not for the righteous. He came for those who are sick. He came for those who are lost. He came for, you might say, the broken. And that's why we have to be very careful and have a free judgment zone in our churches when it comes to where people stand with God. Because we want them to become a Christian. We want them to become a believer of Jesus, a follower. That's what Jesus wants from them. But we don't do that by judging who they are, or what their past is, or what they've done. We do it the way Jesus teaches us here in this story, by loving them the way they are, and yet still wanting them to be different. That's what you see here in John chapter 8. You see a woman who was broken, but you see also a woman who was ashamed, a woman who was afraid. You think about how much shame she must have felt as these scribes and Pharisees were dragging her to the temple to Jesus. We've talked a bit in these 42 weeks about the Pharisees. We know that they were good people. They as far as following the law, they tried their best to follow the law, but in their hearts, they were always wrong. They looked down on others. They judged others, and Jesus had to call them out on it. But scribes that were with these Pharisees, they were also very important people who were respected as well throughout the nation. They were people who had knowledge of the law, like Pharisees, but they could also draft legal documents. When it came to marriages, when it came to divorce or loans or some inheritance, mortgages, the sale of some property, all kinds of things like that. So scribes were very important, and each village had at least one. And these scribes and the Pharisees, they bring this woman to Jesus. No doubt she is ashamed at this time because she has been caught red-handed having sexual relations with a man who was not her husband. No doubt she was afraid too, because she knew what this meant. She knew what they could do to her. She knew there was no out. She knew that she was caught in the act, and the law called for her to be stoned. Every one of us can be found in this story in some way. Maybe our brokenness is not the same brokenness as this woman, but broken is broken, isn't it? See, if we're religious people, we're in this story. Even if you're not a religious person and you're hearing this, you're in this story. If we're conservative and we believe that sin should be handled straightforward and to the point, we have something to learn here. If we're liberal and we believe that sin should be handled in a more tolerant way, we have something to learn here. But more important than all of this is this. If we've blown it, if we have failed in some way, if we've taken the wrong road in life, if we've made the wrong choices, if we've sinned, and if we've been broken more than once, which is the case in life, if we've been caught in the act and we're broken, then this story demonstrates how Jesus takes brokenness and turns it into a blessing. Because as Merritt points out, when we come to Jesus, he will give you grace. Now, this woman in this story, she's not coming to Jesus willingly. In some of our other weeks, people were flocking to Jesus because they knew about him and who he was. But in this story, it was different. And we still end up seeing Jesus bring grace for broken people. And he had to, because that's who he came for, right? This story from John chapter 8 takes place early in the morning when Jesus comes to the temple. And people come there and they are sitting down so that Jesus can teach them. These scribes and Pharisees, they come in at this time. It's like a Bible study time for us would be, dragging this woman. Now make no mistake, this woman doesn't mean anything to these Pharisees and scribes. They had no desire for her to get a second chance. They had no desire for her to repent, to be made new. She was just their pawn in a game. Remember, these scribes and these Pharisees, they were over and over looking for opportunities where they could trap Jesus, where they could drag him off instead like they were this woman. And then they think that this may be the time where they actually have Jesus. They know now that of all the places in the temple, considered the most holy place of all for them, with all these religious people around, that Jesus would have to agree with them that this lady needed to be stoned, and if he didn't, then they would probably just leave her be and drag him off instead. And they bring her in. They go straight to Jesus. They let him know, listen, this lady was caught in the act of adultery, and according to the law of Moses, that Moses commanded way back in the Old Testament, when this happened with such a woman, they are to be stoned. And they want to know what Jesus thinks of the situation. And Jesus does something very odd here. He doesn't respond at first. What does he do? He bends down and begins to write on the ground. Remember, their ground wasn't like these fancy buildings we have today, carpeted and stuff like that. He was writing in some dirt. Now, we have no idea what he was writing. Was he actually writing? Was he just doodling? I don't know. Merritt points out this, though, in this chapter, that the Greek word that John used for write means to write against. So Merritt mentions that it's possible that Jesus was writing against things against these Pharisees, maybe their sins, like hypocrisy in the ground. We don't know what he was writing, and to be honest, that's not important. It's one of those things we would like to know, but we just don't know. But what really matters is what happens next. Because as I read it earlier, verse 7 says this, and as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, let him who was without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And there you have it. It's the perfect response. Because all of these people, the Pharisees and scribes, all of them had broken lives as well. As Paul says in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so what do? Here's a group of men, highly respected of all the religious leaders, dragging this woman in who was caught in the act of adultery to Jesus. Maybe they already have their stones in their hands, because the law was very clear on this, right? And then as soon as Jesus stands up and says these words right here, let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. As soon as Jesus said these words, this lady had to know that Jesus was different. Jesus says those words, and what does he do? He then bends down again and begins to write on the ground more. The Bible tells us that when they heard it, when these men heard that, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with this woman standing before them. I like to imagine that if they did have their stones already in their hands, that while Jesus was writing on the ground, he would hear a stone drop and footsteps walking away. Another stone drop and footsteps walking away until they were all gone. However it went, they heard what Jesus said and they all left. And it's at this time, I believe, that she understood that Jesus will remove our guilt. Being broken's tough, isn't it? Whenever we're caught in the act, or even just knowing that we're broken, it can bring shame, it can bring guilt upon us. And Jesus, as we see over and over, was just so different from any other man she had met. For starters, as Merritt points out, Jesus used the term woman when he met her. Doesn't sound like a big deal to us, but the term woman, the word that he used, was a term of respect, which today would be like us saying the word ma'am to a woman. Jesus actually used this same word for woman when he was talking to his mother from the cross. And when this woman notices what all's going on here, all these men have left her alone with Jesus, she's got to be wondering, okay, what's Jesus going to do next? And we read that Jesus stood up and he says to her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And she replies and says, no one, Lord. And Jesus finishes this story off by saying that neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. Now, here's what I was talking about with that judgment stuff later. Jesus doesn't just act like she didn't sin. He says, go and sin no more. And so what we see here is that Jesus will lead us to goodness. Maybe you've heard the saying, love the sinner, hate the sin. And while those words may not appear in the Bible, in the scripture anywhere, you see that taking place here in this story. Jesus loved this woman. And he's willing to forgive her of her sin, to be made new. But her sin was not excuse. Jesus looked at her and says, he doesn't look at her and say, like you would hear today in our society, well, times are different now. That law was written a long time ago. It's okay. He doesn't look at her and say, just do whatever makes you happy. Those are things we would hear in our society today. Jesus, just as Jesus said here, Jesus doesn't condemn her, but he does condemn the sin. When he says, go now and sin no more, he's letting her know that, hey, you've got a chance to start over. That was wrong. Sin no more. Sin is sin. And when we do sin, we become broken. See, the finish of this story and what Jesus said at the end there, at the last part of it, is just as important as the way he handles the Pharisees. Because Jesus basically looks at this woman and he says, you have a new life. Go and sin no more. And Jesus looks at us and he loves us the same way. He loves us the way we are. But he loves us too much to let us stay that way. Condemning people, that's not our responsibility. Condemning sin is, as Christians. We have to speak out against sin. Jesus gives us grace. And with that grace, he's able to remove all guilt. He's able to remove all shame. He's able to make us new and give us new lives. He leads us to goodness. When this woman met Jesus, her brokenness was then turned into blessing. That's the business Jesus is in. Taking broken people and turning their life, their situation, into a blessing. I want to thank you for joining us here as we continue to go through these 52 weeks with Jesus. We have 10 more of these left in this series. Hope you've enjoyed it. Stay safe and God bless.